Hi, everybody. Welcome back to another presentation. I'm very excited. I am Eugene Popa, your host for this event, and I have with us right now Dr. Dawson Church, who is an award-winning science writer with 3 best-selling books. To his credit, The Genie in Your Genes, and you know the website also, geniegenes.com, was the first book to demonstrate that emotions drive gene expression. Also, Mind to Matter, that show that the brain creates much of what we think of as objective reality. And also Bliss Brain, that demonstrates that peak mental states rapidly remodel the brain for happiness. Dawson has conducted dozens of clinical trials and founded the National Institute for Integrative Healthcare to promote groundbreaking new treatments. Its largest programs, the Veterans Stress Program, has offered free treatment to over 20,000 veterans with PTSD over the past decade. He also shares how to apply, these health and performance breakthrough through EFT Universe on his website, EFTuniverse.com, one of the largest alternative medicine sites on the web. So everyone, please welcome Dawson Church. Thank you so much for saying yes to our invitation. I know you got a very, very busy schedule, so I'm very happy we got to squeeze this in.
Eugene, it's a pleasure. And I just love sharing about trauma and how to release it, because if people live their whole lives traumatized, it produces effects on their health and well-being. We know from research like the ACE study, adverse childhood experiences, that if people have adverse childhood experiences when they're young, when they're 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years old, that 50 years later, they're showing up in hospital with more cancer, more heart disease, more hepatitis, more suicide attempts, more smoking, more diabetes, more obesity. All these kinds of diseases show up 50 years after that. So it's so powerful to learn to tackle and deal with trauma and then make sure we don't live a life that's driven by it. So you're performing a really valuable service here, Eugene, and I know that many people will be affected by this, will be really shifted by this, and they're getting such good practical ideas too about dealing with trauma and then not carrying it forward into their lives. And then the good news from research is that it's possible to heal from trauma. We didn't know that 20, 30, 40 years ago. We know that today. And when I began studying PTSD in depth, I was doing studies on anxiety, depression, and various other kinds of psychological issues. And in 2006, there were a lot of troops coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan, US soldiers, and they had high levels of PTSD. And so the American Psychiatric Association commissioned a study of all the scientific literature that was available to determine what were the effective treatments. And it was a very bleak assessment. Back then in 2006, they said, we've gone back through all the science, all the published clinical trials over the last 50 years, and there's pretty much very little we can do to help with PTSD. They said it's an intractable condition, which means it doesn't get better over time, and it's treatment resistant. And so people who get treatment usually drop out, and it's very rarely successful. That was the state of the art in 2006. So now in the last just less than 2 decades, things have changed, and we now have a dramatic array of treatments. I've done clinical trials, I've worked on clinical trials that show a 90% cure rate for PTSD symptoms like anxiety, like flashbacks, nightmares, intrusive thoughts, 90% cure rate in 6 one-hour sessions. So the whole landscape has changed dramatically. And we now have these wonderful therapies, evidence-based therapies that we know do that. And so the crucial thing here is, how do you take these patterns of behavior and shift them so that they don't persist over time? And we know that people who get triggered, who are triggered, tend to get re-triggered. And there's a phenomenon called re-traumatization. And when the first group of researchers began to work with World War II veterans in the 1950s, they knew that they were having these floods of memories. So they'd served in combat in France, or they'd maybe been in the invasion of Normandy, maybe they'd served in Italy or one of the African theaters. There were all of these World War II veterans, which were being treated by psychiatrists and psychologists after World War II. And we knew then about the talking cure, Freudian psychoanalysis. Lay someone on the couch, have them tell you about their problems. And what one of the prominent psychiatrists of the time wrote about this after he tried Freudian talk therapy with his veteran patients, he said that these therapies are not just ineffective, they're harmful.
They're harmful, yeah.
They're harmful because then in the 1970s, another great therapist, Charles Figley, coined the term re-traumatization. If you've had the car crash, if you've had the terrible divorce, if you've had the traumatic childhood, and you sit there and talk about it or lay on a couch and talk about it, you remember those memories, you fire those neural pathways in your brain, and you re-traumatize yourself. So it's actually re-traumatizing to talk about past trauma unless you have a way of releasing it. And releasing it through the mind is rarely successful. You can't usually do it through mental persuasion. You can't say, gee, I shouldn't have a flashback, I shouldn't have a nightmare, I shouldn't have intrusive thoughts, because they happen, they intrude on normal thinking. So what all these new therapies have in common, therapies like EMDR, eye movement, reprocessing and desensitization, EFT, emotional freedom techniques, tapping, somatic experiencing, yoga therapy, all of these therapies have the same thing in common, and that is they reach the level of the body. And so you aren't just trying to think yourself out of trauma, you're experiencing a new reality. And that's this phenomenon of memory, reconsolidation, and extinction. You can literally take somebody who's processing old memories, who's just having a trauma loop. The trauma loop, like for example, one man I talked to had been traumatized by losing all his money, all his retirement savings, and his medical practice in the recession of 2007. And he said it's like a huge weight, like a bowling ball in my intestines, in my stomach. It's a huge weight. So he felt it physically. I worked with him. We worked on the physical sensations. We worked on the events. We worked on childhood memories that were similar to the current event. We did this all in one session. And that bowling ball in his intestines shrunk to the size of a tennis ball, then to the size of a golf ball, then to the size of a pinhead, and then disappeared. And with that physical shift in his body, suddenly all the similar experiences in his mind shifted, and he was actually able to see his losses as the opportunity for a fresh start in his life. So people see the reality very differently as you work on these physiological feelings in their body. So the crucial thing you need to do is stay in the body. When people are re-experiencing it and they're traumatized, they tend to leave their bodies. In a book I wrote on psychological trauma, I have an image, a drawing by an incest survivor. And it's a really chilling drawing. And it's a little girl, and she's in a corner, and she has her hands in front of her, and she's in a hunched over position. She has a hat on her head. So that's trying to protect myself. That's the child trying to protect myself. And this incest survivor in a little symbolic drawing is trying to protect herself like that. And then there's a great big gray hand reaching in all the way through her body to the other side. So obviously her attempt to protect herself has been unsuccessful. She's violated. This huge gray hand goes all the way through her. She's huddled in a corner. And then there's a really odd element to her drawing. And then there's a smiley face, a little round circle with a smiley mouth hovering in the corner of the room. And so people look at me and say, why is there a smiley face there? And I tell them, that's her. She's left her body. Traumatized people leave their bodies. If you're lying in a foxhole in Ukraine and there's a firefight around you, your body is an unsafe place to be. You want to escape. When you're thinking about that experience a year later, 6 months later, you don't want to be there, you escape. So veterans escape from their bodies. People who are traumatized by PTSD, like the little girl, they're the smiley face over there in the corner of the room. They are not in their bodies. And so all of these new therapies, EFT tapping, EMDR, other movement-based therapies, body-based therapies, keep people breathing, keep people in their bodies while they're re-experiencing the trauma. And if you do this, a very interesting thing happens. You're giving the person now an experience of safety while they're in their body. And what that does is that violates the expectation that they have to leave. When you give them an experience of safety by, EFT uses tapping on acupuncture points, EMDR uses eye movements, EMDR also uses certain kinds of tapping, like this is one kind of tapping used in both EMDR and other kinds of therapies. You simply hold yourself and you're stimulating your body like this, keeps you in your body. So you do some kind of tapping, eye movements, and now you're re-experiencing the trauma, just like re-traumatization, except that you're staying in your body, and you realize after you've done that, that I've relived that terrible nightmarish experience, and I'm still breathing, and I'm still alive. So now you haven't experienced it as a disembodied entity like the little girl. You're now experiencing the trauma, and you're realizing I am still breathing, and I am still here, and I survived. Really important component there. And what we find that people do when they go through an EFT experience like that, or a tapping experience, and they are staying in their bodies and they realize they're surviving, then they integrate the experience. And that's the crucial difference. They aren't dissociating, they're integrating that. And we call this memory reconsolidation and extinction because you have the memory still, like you can still talk about the terrible thing that happened. Like I had one young veteran I worked with, he was in his late 20s. And when he was in Iraq, he went there as a medic and he spent a tour of duty in Iraq. As a medic, one of the things he had to do was he had to clean the uniforms of soldiers who'd been killed in combat to send back with their personal effects to the USA. And one day that happened to be the uniform of a friend of his who'd been shot. And so there he had this uniform he had to clean. And this uniform, this guy's body had been found several days after he'd been shot. The body smelled really bad. It was blood and brains all over the helmet, over the uniform. And now his friend has to clean out this uniform. So this young man was tapping on acupressure points while he was doing this, while he was telling me this terrible story. And initially, this was like the worst event of his life. In fact, the smell of the uniform was so bad. When he was cleaning the uniform back in Iraq in 2004, he actually had to dip it in bleach and then run out of the room because it smelled so bad, hyperventilate, get some air in his lungs, hold his breath, run back and clean the uniform some more until he was finished. So it's a terrible memory for him. He was triggered. He was 10 out of 10 for his emotional response to this tragedy of his friend being killed and cleaning the uniform. But we did this extensive tapping session with him. He dropped down to a 0 out of 10. And once he had that experience of safety, of being in his body and re-experiencing it, he said, you know, Dawson, I'm glad I was the person who got to clean the uniform because that allowed me to serve him one last time and to serve the people he loved. So his narrative, his view of the event had changed. The event was unchanged. The event was still a tragedy, but the lens, the frame through which he saw the event had completely altered. That's what we see when people are able to be in their bodies and we experience these events. So we now have many randomized controlled trials. We have a meta-analysis of studies. We have a ton of stories of people who have done this. And we find that this happens for about 9 out of 10 veterans. They're able to release those burdens of trauma, and then they learn to breathe, they find themselves in their bodies. And when they realize the first time they try this, and they realize that they can shift, then they're able to shift other events and eventually not be afflicted by all of those symptoms. And then they still have the memory. That's why it's called memory reconsolidation. But now, the memory is tagged in the brain no longer as traumatic stress, it's tagged with a positive emotional overlay. I served, I did something that helped that family. I had a last act of service for my friend. So now they remember the event, but what's extinguished is, that's why it's called memory, reconsolidation, and extinction. What's extinguished is all the negative emotion they had attached to that memory. That pops off, and then they shift. And the last thing I'll say before we go into some questions and we explore this further is that these changes are not just psychological and physical, they're also genetic. We've done research into the genetics of this, and we find, I did a large-scale clinical trial of veterans who received 10 sessions of EFT tapping. They had high levels of PTSD beforehand, and then when they finished the clinical trial, after 10 sessions, they had low levels of PTSD, and their genes changed. So stress is epigenetic. When you are stressed, when you're traumatized, when you're remembering a bad event, you are turning on genes, like genes that code for adrenaline, cortisol, catecholamines. All of these stress chemicals are being turned on genetically by consciousness, by your awareness, by your memory of traumatic events. When you've been treated successfully using these body-based therapies like EFT, then you still remember the bad things, but you no longer have the stress response, and you have an epigenetic effect. These stress chemicals are no longer being turned on. We've done several clinical trials that show much lower levels of cortisol after you do this. In one scientific study, it was a triple-blind, randomized controlled trial, the highest standard of scientific proof. We found that after getting either EFT for 1 hour or talk therapy or rest, that the cortisol levels of the people who got EFT dropped dramatically more. Their anxiety and depression dropped twice as much as the talk therapy and the rest groups. So we know now from these clinical trials, advanced clinical trials, that they lower your stress hormones. They're epigenetic, they're dialing down genes that have to do with stress. And then you feel much better afterwards because you've shifted your body's response to that initial trauma. So the good news here is we don't have to live with trauma. You don't have to drag along this heavy bag of all those traumatic events into your future and be like those people in the adverse childhood events studies and be having to deal with the burden of sickness later on in your life. You get to liberate yourself from all of that and live an emotionally free life. And we've now worked with over 20,000 veterans in the Veteran Stress Solution. If you know a veteran, if you are a veteran, you can get free treatment at the Veteran Stress Solution website. So we encourage you to go there, take advantage of that. If you aren't a veteran, you can get free treatment and a free session using the Stress Solution app. Just go to Stress Solution, type it into the App Store, pull it up, get a free session there. Feel the changes in your body. You don't want to be one of those people who 50 years after their childhood is still dealing with the medical consequences of unhealed trauma. You want to be one of those people who proactively goes and heals this so you can have a happy and fulfilled adulthood. And you also will have a much longer lifespan doing that. So that's the good news now. 2006, the message was there are no effective treatments for trauma. PTSD is an intractable condition. Now, in the 2020s, we know from tons of research that we can liberate ourselves from that. We can reconsolidate those old memories. We can liberate ourselves from the emotional impact of them, and we can live happy lives.
Happily ever after. Awesome. So I actually have a few questions. You say that you have created a protocol for working with patients or clients or people with PTSD. Is like it's a set 6-session protocol. Did I get that right?
The 6-session protocol. We recommend a minimum of 6 1-hour sessions.
Okay, with these 6 sessions, you have a 90% success rate. Now, is there like something in particular that I don't know, like kind of give us a sneak peek in the sessions, like do you take like 3 sessions to build rapport with the client? Because I've heard this from other therapists, like we need rapport and we need to trust each other and establish a therapeutic relationship before any change can happen. So how what would be the biography of your 6 sessions, so to speak?
Yeah, the 6 sessions are very interesting. We take a few minutes to establish rapport, but only a few minutes. We don't spend a lot of time doing that. We want the client to feel the changes in their body really fast. So within the first 10 minutes of the first session, we're usually having them do a body-based therapy and feel the changes in their bodies. They feel them right away. At that point, they know this works and they move from there. We also have them do a little bit of homework in advance. So Eugene, we'll ask the veterans usually to make a list of the things that bothered them. So write down what event happened when you were 5, what event happened when you were 7, 9, 12, 15. So they'll come in with lists of events. We also evaluate the emotional impact of events using a scale from 0 to 10. When you think about your father beating you with a strap when you were 5 years old, what's your number, 0 through 10? And they'll say it's an 8. So we'll have them do this tapping or this breathing or these eye movements. And then we'll say, okay, now that you've done that for 5 minutes, what's your new number? And they'll say it's a 3 or a 2. So right away they're saying, wow, I went from an 8 to a 3 in 5 minutes. They then gain confidence, and we then work through these lists of issues really quickly.
Okay, awesome. So many times, many people, you know, or let's say the general perception on trauma is that it is related to war, one way or another. But it's not so, is it? I mean, like for instance, the story with the soldier who was cleaning up his friend's clothing, even though he was in a situation of war, that, you know, the soldier who was doing the cleaning was not in combat when that happened. So his trauma was not necessarily directly related to war. It could have been his friend died somewhere and now he was cleaning his, you know, his friend's clothes without being in the war, and he still got traumatized. So can you speak a little bit to this point? You know, the trauma can occur even out of some of the most, you know, simple interactions, if you will, but we do get traumatized.
We do get traumatized, and many people are traumatized not at that same level that say Rwandan. We've worked with a lot of Rwandan orphans that were orphaned by the genocide there, and I mean these were kids who were 3 or 4 or 5 years old, and their parents were killed with machetes. So this is, you know, that's one level of trauma. But we find that people, like I have a friend called Rick Hansen who wrote a book called Bliss Brain, and I've interviewed him a number of times, and Rick said, you know, Dawson, I grew up in an ideal situation. There was no one even shouted or swore at each other in my family. How come I wound up having anxiety when I was an adult? And so many people find that when they look at their childhood, there were traumatic things. I remember a trauma specialist talked to Deepak Chopra, and Deepak Chopra said, oh, you know, I know childhood trauma. And it took that therapist 3 sessions to uncover childhood trauma in Deepak Chopra. So many people have trauma, and need not be the result of something as dramatic as death or dismemberment. One man, we worked with him on his childhood, and then it boiled down to an event. One crucial event for him was when he was a baby, maybe 6, 9 months old, and his father had been putting him into his crib at night, and his father, as he bent down, misjudged the distance and just dropped the baby a few inches, and the baby fell onto the mattress, soft mattress, just a few inches. And yet this was one of the most traumatic events of this man's life. And he gone on later to develop beliefs, core beliefs about the world, worldviews like the world is not a safe place. And it turned, it had been something that happened that we would think of as a very minor incident at the age of 6 or 9 months. So that doesn't have to be war or a terrible car accident. Often we're traumatized by things like the lack of attention. You're in a big family, there are 4 other children, and your needs aren't getting met, your voice isn't being heard, maybe you're being bullied by somebody. So it doesn't have to be a big T trauma to traumatize people. A little T trauma can do that as well.
And can multiple small T trauma, can they equate like a big T trauma? Is that something that, like, you know, I didn't have, like, for instance, people say, well, I was not in Rwanda or I was not in the war, but I was repeatedly small T traumatized, you know, for a long period of time. Would that, you know, kind of be on the same, on par with a big T trauma?
Yeah, and some people are resilient. This is the whole feel the resilience. And I published several clinical trials on resilience.
Yeah.
And so some people are resilient and they can handle a lot of adversity and they don't get traumatized. Other people have a very small amount of adversity, of just a few small t traumas, and they do, but they can be cumulative as well. And so you have that initial one at the age of 6 or 9 months, then something else happens when you're 2, and then 4. And these are often very small things, like you're 3 years old, you have a pet rabbit, and the rabbit gets out of the cage and the dog kills the rabbit. So again, it seems like a small thing. Your mother says, "Don't cry, Jimmy, we'll buy you a new rabbit." But again, what's she teaching you to do? She's teaching you to do emotional bypassing. She's not dealing with the death of your rabbit. She's saying, "We'll buy you a new rabbit." She's having you think about something else and not dealing with your grief. Adults often don't know how to deal with the feelings of children, and their own trauma is triggered when their kids start crying. So that's how you want to work with it. Find those events that happened when the child was little. The rabbit might have died at the age of 3. Grandma might have died at the age of when she was 5 years old or 6 years old. Now she has grandma's death as well. Maybe her best friend moved away to another country when she was 7. All these little things add up after a while, and then you wind up with an adult who has a worldview, a story about the reality of the world, saying the world is a safe place.
Yeah.
Now she has that belief, and now she starts to unconsciously create events that are supportive of that negative belief. And she'll say to you, "See, my boyfriend left me. See, my husband doesn't trust me. See, my employer betrayed me." And she'll have this whole long litany, this whole long catalog of adult events proving her negative worldview. But in reality, it all began when she was a child. And it's a self-reinforcing loop, and it keeps on running until you break the loop, deal with your childhood trauma. Then you develop a whole new worldview.
And is there something we can do to prevent, because you're talking about resilience, is there something we can do to build up resilience so that we don't get traumatized?
That is such a good question, Eugene, because resilient people still have a car crash, still have a divorce, still have a financial crisis, whatever it might be. Bad things are happening in the world and the news. So resilient people have the inner resources, the inner strength from within to meet those issues. And you want to be doing that resilience building before you have a major adult trauma. And that has to do with the volume of nerve cells in structures of the brain, like the hippocampus, the emotional part of the brain. If there are parts of the hippocampus that are developed by meditation. In fact, in one of my books, Mind to Matter, I have a case history of a man who began to meditate, and within 8 weeks, he'd grown the emotion regulation, the resilience part of his brain by 22.8%. It grew dramatically as he learned to meditate, and then he became more resilient. So you want to grow those parts of the brain before you're traumatized by dealing with your past trauma, meditating, building up your resources. So you have a lot of neural structure in those parts of the brain that make you resilient. And then bad things happen. Like in my new book, Bliss Brain, I talk about, in chapter 1 of Bliss Brain, I talk about the shattering event in my life in the last few years, which was that in a wildfire in California, it just swept through our city. And within moments, our house had been burned. We literally fled in our car through the flames as trees were bursting into flame all around us.
Wow.
And that night, 5,400 homes were destroyed in our town of Santa Rosa, California. And so we lived through that. It was an unbelievably traumatic event, but as meditators, as tappers, we were resilient, and we were able to then navigate the next couple of years. Was it easy? No, it wasn't. But we had the inner resources, we had the brain fibers in those parts of the brain that make us resilient. So you want to develop those before the wildfire, before the job loss, before the divorce. So you are one of those resilient people, and you do it in meditation and tapping. So tapping releases past trauma. Meditation builds those nerve fibers, and it doesn't take 10 years or 10,000 hours. Within just a couple of months, you can start to build up more neural tissue in those resilient circuits.
Awesome. And actually, I just wanted to add on, not like completing, but just to, broaden the perspective here. Meditation does not just prevent you from trauma. It has, so many other benefits than just, preventing trauma. And of course, it always, a positive thing to do. And because what I'm trying to get to is, if we tell people now, oh, start doing meditation so you don't get traumatized, it's kind of like, you do the meditation for all the wrong reasons. Like, you're running away from trauma that might happen. So you're kind of like forward thinking that it would happen. So just wanted to make that clear for everybody who's listening.
Well, that's an interesting way to look at it, because there are two levels of human development here. And if you think about a baseline, think about the ground level. So there's stuff below the ground level that's subterranean that we need to clear. And then the stuff above the ground level, that's peak experiences. And so you have to clear anxiety, depression, traumatic stress below the ground level. But when you get to that point of clearing, and you've done therapy, you've done EFT, you've done all of these practices to clear your trauma, you're just at ground level with no anxiety, no depression, no traumatic stress.
Yeah.
That's great. But then how about moving up into what Abraham Maslow called self-actualization, where you start to move into peak states? So my newest research is all about flow states, peak states, transcendent experiences. And we're showing that when people clear trauma first, that stuff below ground level, then they can move into these peak experiences. That's why the book's called Bliss Brain, because you get extremely happy. And so I have a picture, a photograph in there of me after the fire. It's a few months after the fire. We're not only had the fire, we've lost all our possessions. We've also had a huge number of other bad things happen in the year after the fire. And my wife took this photograph of me in meditation. I'm sitting there with a huge smile on my face, feeling wonderful. And that's where you can be even after you've dealt with life's tragedies. So you can have these wonderful states of bliss, even though you're struggling in the outside world.
Yeah. All right. So this raises another question, and that is, there again, like there are two ways of looking, into personal development. And one is, look for the best stuff to clear it, or focus exclusively on the good stuff, and then the bad stuff will clear because you increase the good stuff. And so what is your take on that? Because some people say, well, if you focus on the shitty stuff, if you focus on trauma, then it'll become a self-fulfilling prophecy, because anything in your mind will shift to match the criteria of trauma. So it's like almost every single experience will become a trauma, and you'll have so much to clean, whereas it's not really so. So you should instead focus on the bliss brain, basically focus on the peak performance. And if you do that, then this kind of will be taking care of itself. What is your opinion on that?
That is such an intriguing question. So if you focus on things, you tend to amplify them. If you focus on trauma, one that amplify the trauma, you should focus on the positive and amplify that. So this is why I love science, Eugene, because which is correct, which view is correct. They're diametrically opposing views. Either this way, one's correct, or that one's correct, and they both can't be correct. So which one is it? And so you want to just look at science. So what I do when I am confronted with a question like that is I go look at the studies, and I read the science and see what the science shows. And the science on this point is extremely clear. You absolutely have to go and deal with trauma. If you try and go to those peak states while not having healed your trauma, that stuff, that traumatized stuff in the basement down there below the surface starts to fester, and it becomes the shadow self, the dark side. And so that's why you see all of these people, all of these wonderful spiritual teachers. We've had a massive scandal in Buddhism in the last 5 years, these elevated spiritual teachers, but their dark side, their shadow self, is doing all kinds of things that are pretty ugly. John of God, the great healer from Brazil, and for decades, people have looked up to John of God, and now is in jail for 17 years for molesting, for raping his students. That's the dark side. Do these people have the light side? They do, but they haven't healed the trauma. And if you look at Christianity, Buddhism, Hinduism, all the religions, all the great philosophical traditions, if you try and climb the mountaintop without dealing with all that stuff down below, then it becomes the dark side. So the answer in research is really clear. You have to go there and deal with the dark side. What happens is if you're focusing on it and you're clearing it using tapping and other techniques, is you have a catharsis. You let go of all that negative emotion. You're remembering your friend being killed, but now you deal with it and you go from an 8 to a 2. So you go way, way, way down in your triggering. You clear all that stuff. You clear your childhood. Then from that clear perspective below the surface, you have a solid foundation. You then start to climb the mountaintop to self-actualization, to transcendence, and then those experiences are real. So that's what that's the answer that science gives us.
I love it. I love it. Thank you so much for this answer. This, this has answered so many questions for myself, and I'm sure for everybody who's watching. So now, continuing on this question, here's my next question. Now, when you say you have to clear and deal with the trauma, is this something that you are consciously aware of? Like, you have some, bad luggage that you're carrying it on? Or is it like, oh, hey, you know what, you have to dig for it, even though you don't know what it is? Go and dig and you'll find some trauma. Because I've had many clients coming to me and says, well, I feel fine, but I think I should dig in my past and find some traumatic events to release them. And I say, which ones? And they go, I don't know. You shouldn't find them out for me. So that's why I'm asking this question, because some people, they're kind of like, they want to find trauma, even though there might not be. So the question is, do you actually go and find, or you actually start from, hey, you know what, I actually have some troublesome experiences, and by clearing those, then I'm ready for peak performance? Or which one is it? That's my question.
Yeah, and I teach a lot of classes. I teach a lot of therapists, doctors, nurses, coaches, teach a lot of live classes, because we teach EFT to clear that trauma. And this is a question that we have to deal with, because there's consciously remembered trauma. I remember my buddy dying when I was 3 years old. I remember grandma dying when I was 7. That's conscious trauma. But things that happen at the age of 2 months, 3 months, 1 year, 2 years, that's before episodic memory began. Most people's earliest memories are around 2. What happens if the bad stuff happened before the age of 2? I saw an ultrasound of a baby in the womb, and the baby there in the womb, they're just moving around slowly, and the ultrasound is capturing the fetus there in the amniotic fluid. And then the mother and father start fighting and screaming and yelling at each other, and the baby starts jerking around. The baby's being traumatized in the womb. What happens if you have womb trauma? You don't remember any of that. Don't remember prenatal trauma, pre-verbal trauma. So you have special techniques for we train people in who are professionals that are able to work with those, and they essentially are working at the level of the body, because you may not remember anything, but you're having a physical feeling of some kind. Like they may remember, they may say, when I'm with new people, when I'm with unfamiliar people, I have this uneasy feeling in my body. That's a clue right there. There's probably pre-verbal or prenatal trauma. Those take special techniques to deal with. We train our therapists and train our practitioners to deal with them. The body, the wonderful phrase of my dear friend Bessel van der Kolk.
I was going to talk about that.
Score. The body keeps a score. And so people know in their bodies, they have this uneasy feeling, the bowling ball in my intestines, this terrible feeling in my gut. One German doctor I worked with, she said, the iron bar across my shoulders. I mean, they're feeling it in the body, and you need special techniques to reach pre-verbal and prenatal trauma.
Wonderful. Wow. Such a wealth of knowledge here. So the body keeps the score, and then the body releases the score, right? Because you're talking about, somatic experiencing. You're talking about, using the body to reconsolidate that event and reconsolidate the memory by using the body. So I actually have a question here. When you do the intervention, there are many psychological interventions that you can do, and some of them are not using the body. Would you say that it is essential to involve the body in the therapeutic process to release a trauma, or can it be done without?
The mind is useful in telling you what's going on with the body and reporting on that. But Milton Friedman was a great founder of the whole field of clinical hypnotherapy in the 1960s and 70s, one of the great therapists of the 20th century, Milton Friedman. And he said the same thing the Buddha said 2,000 years ago. He said, the mind usually is what keeps us stuck. The mind keeps us suffering. And he is famously quoted as saying, Milton Friedman said, the only constructive function the mind plays in therapy is writing the checks and paying the therapist. Otherwise, it is completely useless and an obstacle. So we were trying to confuse the mind. And I know if you watch me, my YouTube videos, or watch me in a live workshop, one of my live workshops, you'll see I do a lot of sessions with people, and I'm saying really crazy things to them. And we're doing the eye movements, we're doing the tapping, we're doing all these therapeutic interventions that are body-based. And I'm having them say things with their minds. And like I might have them say, I'm a wonderful mother. I'm a terrible mother. I'm the world's best mother. I'm the world's worst mother. Now, after a while, the mind gets so confused, just kind of collapses, and that's when healing takes place. So getting the mind out of the way is usually the gateway to healing.
Gotcha. Wonderful. You're saying that when you were working with the soldier, that as you went through the session with him, then his narrative changed about the event. And he saw that as a last service that he did for his friend and for his family, for his friend's family. In these situations, do you ask for a change in narrative? Do you ask the client or the patient to find a life lesson in that experience, or is that something that emerges by itself?
That's another great question. And when we train people, we find one of the mistakes that novices do is they try and help the client reframe. They try and help the client find positive meaning in the event, and we tell them, don't do that. If there's one thing that we say to almost every person we train is, we understand you are feeling empathy for this person, you want them to get better, and you want to give them a positive reframe. Just don't do it. Because the positive reframe is recapping mom when you were 3 years old and the rabbit dies, putting her hand on your shoulder and saying, we'll buy you another bunny. It's that's what your parents did. They try to say, they said, this too will pass. Don't worry, you'll make new friends when your friend moves away. And when grandma dies, they're all very quiet, don't say anything. So we're in a society that tries to get us to think positively. And that means that most people never really have the ability, the time, the tools to go and deal with their trauma. So they don't deal with it all, and they're told to think positive instead. And what I would tell our trainee practitioners is, this might be the very first time that client has been in a safe space to really feel the feelings. What did the bunny feel like? What did the bunny dying really feel like? Let's feel that. Let's just sit there with that 3-year-old in grief for a while and not make it better. And now you have the safety to navigate the terrible feelings. And that is really powerful. So we train people to do that and not to intervene, not provide positive reframes, let the client feel the depth of their feelings. And the miraculous thing that happens there is that after they felt it, after they cleared it with these body-based techniques, they reframe spontaneously. You'll be having them say, I'm a terrible mother, I'm a wonderful mother, I'm a terrible mother, I'm the world's worst mother, world's best mother. You'll be having them really get into their grief, and they'll suddenly open their eyes and say, I'm an okay mother. I know I made some mistakes with my children, but I'm an okay mother. Now it's the client telling you that. It's not you telling the client that. So we train our practitioners to restrain themselves, to resist the urge to help. Don't try and help that person. Let them feel those feelings. And once they're done shifting all that old trauma in their mind, in their conscious and subconscious, in their body, spontaneously, they will reframe and move into the positive.
All right. Now, you're mentioning about the fact that when a person experiences extreme trauma, big T trauma, they will automatically dissociate, right? They will be like smiley face up there. And in the world of therapy, there is the concept of dissociation as a means to actually heal a traumatic event. So would you say that these two contradict? Because, for instance, one way of doing it is, like you said, you have to go in there and experience it in your body, but now because your body is in a safe place, that will reconsolidate the memory, so you'll release that trauma. And then the other line of thinking is that you go back to that traumatic event, but you go there dissociated, observing yourself from outside, and therefore you can witness what is happening, but you're not suffering anymore, and that will again release the trauma. Do you see I don't know, a problem between these two approaches? Do you think that dissociation is not recommended? What is your opinion?
Dissociation is an adaptive mechanism for a child. So when that young girl was being violated, it was highly adaptive. It was very useful for her to go and be the smiley face in the corner. It was a coping mechanism to not be in her body when she was being violated. So dissociation is a childhood coping strategy. And so what we can use dissociation for as adults is to, if people cannot face the issue directly, we can introduce layers of dissociation. So we have what we call an EFT. We have what we call the 3 gentle techniques. And I remember one man in a workshop of mine, and this man had a really sad energy about him. He was walking around, he was very sad. And I talked to him during one of the breaks, and he said, yeah, my mother died. I've had a lot of tragedy in my family. I have this huge dam of grief that is behind this dam, and I put my finger in the dam to try and stop it from leaking, because I know if I pull my finger out and there's one trickle, the dam will break and obliterate me. And so overwhelming trauma. What do you do when someone has overwhelming negative emotion like that? And so we teach the 3 gentle techniques, and the 3 gentle techniques are brilliant, and they actually help the client deal with it by using that childhood adaptive mechanism of dissociation therapeutically, by taking a step back. So for example, we might say, what level of distance do you need from the memory to be able to work on the memory? And some people, for example, will imagine the movie of their traumatic event playing on the movie screen, but there's a curtain in front of the movie. So now they've got one layer of safety with a curtain in front of the movie screen. They might put the movie in a box. Now the movie is playing, but it's in a box. That's a second layer of dissociation. Then maybe they put a lock on the box, 4th layer of dissociation. Now we have them put the box in a safe, 5th layer of dissociation. Then we have them put the safe inside a bank on another continent, another layer of dissociation. So we use as many layers of dissociation as it takes for the client. So now, like I said to one woman, I was doing a workshop in New York. I said, let's put the bank in San Francisco all the way across the US. And she said, let's put the bank on Mars, on the planet Mars.
I was going to say on the moon, but on Mars.
That's how far she needed. So we tapped on the bank and both in Mars, and eventually we brought it back to New York, and we brought it closer and closer and closer. So you introduce enough layers of dissociation so the client can start to work on the issue. And then within about 5 minutes, we brought it closer and closer in. She was able to open the box, watch the movie, and tap and come down to a low number. So that's the use. That's the use of. But again, do this with a therapist. I want to just stress too, EFT is a great self-help technique. If you have PTSD, if you have a diagnosis like that, a serious mental health diagnosis, go work with a trained practitioner. Don't try and do it yourself. If you have if you've sprained your ankle and you want to tap on that, or you have an adult memory, it's fine to do it yourself. Don't go into trauma alone, because the chances are good you will re-traumatize yourself. You don't have the skills to navigate it. So that's just a caution here.
Yeah, I just want to write down the time when you say that, because I want to record it. All right, awesome. So let me ask if this conclusion from what you just said, if this is correct. So unconscious dissociation as a protective mechanism, will be a result of trauma. However, conscious dissociation with a purpose of healing that actually can counteract this one and is beneficial, positive.
That's right. So it's using that old childhood adaptive mechanism therapeutically with adults.
Yeah. That's what I was going for. All right. So one last question from your experience, because you've been working with so many veterans and so many people suffering from PTSD. What would you say is the best approach to PTSD? With the best, what gives the best result, right off the bat, like of the different interventions, methods, techniques, and so on? What is your experience with that?
Yeah, and again, here science is really clear on this. So science shows us that body-based interventions are a way of resolving PTSD in just those few sessions. So I've been part of research teams writing what are called treatment guidelines. So we have one set of treatment guidelines for PTSD. It was published by this healthcare system called Kaiser Permanente in the US. There's another Swiss journal called Healthcare. They publish treatment guidelines for PTSD. And so we recommend that there be what's called a stepped approach. And so the first step is teaching the person who's traumatized EFT, having them learn tapping, and also the techniques of EMDR, eye movement and tapping. But EMDR you do with a therapist in an office, or you can do it over Zoom or over some kind of secure connection. EFT self-help. So you want to make sure the person knows about tapping. So that's number one. Then we believe that it's important to have social support. So don't just be tapping yourself. Have support, have a therapist, have a coach, have somebody you go to, have friends. If you have a husband or wife or kids or parents who can tap with you, tap together, tap in groups. Like now with all the turmoil in the world, we used to have a free monthly tapping circle with hundreds of people that we offer. Now it's a weekly tapping circle because there's just so many people dealing with so much stress in the world. So we're doing this and it's done in groups. So have a support group to support you in your practice, and then making sure you have adequate therapeutic support. Like we train therapists, we train practitioners. We have an app called Stress Solution, and you can go on the app and literally in 5 minutes create an account and be tapping with a trained practitioner. So we recommend you have your practitioner on call. Yeah, it's the first on-demand therapy service like that. And people can just do when they're in crisis, they go on Stress Solution in the app and they just tap with a trained practitioner right then and there. And so have that support. And then again, 1 person in 10, that won't be enough. And that person may need medication, they may need hospitalization, they may need intensive professional intervention. So that's what's called the stepped approach. It's used in the VA, it's used in the National Health Service in England, it's used in a lot of places. So start with manageable things by learning tapping yourself. Make sure you have a therapist or a coach to fall back on. Make sure you have great social support, tap with other people, share with other people. And we found, for example, in a clinical trial of veterans and their spouses in a retreat, a 7-day retreat, we found that of those veterans, about 80% of them got better after the retreat, largely due to handling their issues with that social support. So there are a lot of things you can do. And what I finally say is don't wait till the next crisis. Go start doing the stuff now. Become resilient now and you don't need it. And that way when the next happens and the next disappointment happens, you are a strong and resilient human being and you can meet the challenges of your life.
Thank you so much, Dawson. This was wonderful. Where can people find you? How can they get in touch with you? What is the best way to, learn from you or, benefit from your programs?
Well, start off with downloading a free meditation at my website, Dawson, my name, D-A-W-S-O-N, Dawson Gift, G-I-F-T, dawsongift.com. There's a meditation on there that's free. There's also the EFT tapping mini manual that's free. And then there are links to our classes, our certified practitioners, our stress solution app. All of those resources are accessible through that dawsongift.com link. And then just download the manual, do the meditation, and then monitor your own body. Like think about something that bothered you, then spend 5 minutes tapping and see what your number is. And what we found is that the very first time people try it, because it's a body-based approach, it's an evidence-based approach, they feel a big reduction in triggering and they feel better. So at that point, it's easy to then make a plan for doing that more in your life.
Yeah. So when you say tapping, would this be the one exercise to do, or which one would be like the simplest one people can do right away if they feel stressed or deal with a trauma?
Yeah, if you go to the end of the EFT mini manual, you'll find at dawsongift.com, there's EFT on a page, one page. Just use that one page, try it out, and feel the shift in your body.
Perfect. Amazing. Everybody, you know what to do now. Go and find that, download the program, download the MP3, download the PDF, and go practice. We'll take a quick break, and then we'll see you after the break. We'll see you tomorrow. Dawson, again, thank you so much. It's been wonderful, and I'm feeling so grateful that you've been here with us. Thank you so much.
Eugene, this is a wonderful service to people. I'm so glad you're offering it.
Perfect. So, Dawson, that's it. Thank you so much. I'll see you soon.